Good afternoon and welcome to the 2018 School of Theology Distinguished Alumni Panel. Yeah, we can, yeah, that's I am Dr. Teddy Hickman Maynard. I'm Associate Dean for Students and Community Life and Assistant Professor of Black Church Studies. I'm also an alum myself, 2 times. Finished with my Master of Divinity in 2003 and Ph.D. in 2015 from the School of Theology. I am honored to have been asked to moderate this panel, and I think that by providing these tables for our speakers, I have fulfilled my moderation duties. And so I'm going to introduce them very briefly and then get out of their way, because I am anticipating with great joy the wisdom that is before us on this incredible topic. And so we begin by welcoming the Reverend Laura Jaquith Bartlett, who is a deacon in the Oregon-Idaho Conference and has served in music ministry in local churches, led workshops in congregational song, global praise, and worship design across the country. She's the immediate past president of the National Fellowship of United Methodists in Music and Worship Arts, and was selected as the 2016 General Conference Director of Music and Worship. Won't you help me in joining and welcoming the Reverend Dr. Jerome K. Del Pino is a pastor, teacher, and leader in church and society, an ordained elder in the New England Annual Conference, and retired in 2010 as General Secretary of the General Board of Higher Education in Ministry of the United Methodist Church. He has worked around the world championing the 700 some odd institutions of higher education in the United Methodist Church. And we are so grateful for his presence here. Won't you help me welcome Dr. Jaquith? The Reverend Odette Lockwood-Stewart has led congregations and campus ministries for 41 years as an elder in the United Methodist Church until her retirement in 2017. She's given professional leadership at international, national, regional, and local events of denominational and ecumenical associations, as well as serving as the director of the General Board of Higher Education and Ministry as president of the National Campus Ministry Association. Won't you welcome Reverend Lockwood-Stewart. And finally, in the category of emerging leader, we're welcoming Dr. David Scott, who is Director of Mission Theology for the General Board of Global Ministries of the United Methodist Church. He's a published author and is working on his 2nd book. So, David, we are praying for you right now. I know you're under deadline. You can also find his work at the popular blog, UM and Global, at www.umglobal.org. Won't you welcome Dr. David Scott. So our topic for our speakers, our distinguished alumni this afternoon, is a very light and easy topic to handle. And I'm sure one that I know they will handle with aplomb and ease. We're incredibly excited to hear from them on the topic. We've asked them to identify the three most significant challenges facing us in this particular moment. Just 3. And we've asked them to solve all of them in 10 minutes or less. And so I'll ask that we start to my immediate right, Dr. Bartlett, if you would do us the honor of beginning this distinguished alumni panel.
Well, the first challenge might be how I'm going to act like a doctor when you just conferred that degree upon me.
It's one of my new powers as associate dean.
But you did say 3 challenges. My first confession is that I can actually only think of 1 challenge. Now, I know that's a bit crazy, so bear with me here. I first remember hearing about this one really, really big challenge right here at BU about 30 years ago in Marsh Chapel during the baccalaureate service for my graduating class. Walter Mulder was the Dean Emeritus of the School of Theology at that time. He gave the sermon. Now, I don't remember anything else that he said in that sermon. I don't remember a single thing about that service, although I can see exactly where I was sitting in the chapel as I listened to Dean Mulder tell us that the biggest challenge we would face as we headed off into the world with our brand new diplomas was avoiding the temptation of thinking of people in terms of us and them. And that's it, really. According to Dr. Mulder, well, actually according to the gospel, there is no us and them in God's vision. And as soon as we make that division, we are living lives that are directly antithetical to our mission as disciples of Jesus Christ. And the more I thought about this 3-challenge assignment, the more I realized that all of the challenges I can think of stem from this one thing, us versus them thinking. So let me simply elaborate with 3 examples. Number 1, our care of God's creation. I fervently believe that planet Earth, this home that has been entrusted to us by the Creator, is on the brink of total disaster. When we see our role as exploiters rather than as stewards or caretakers, we are directly contributing to the demise of our world. Now, of course, most people probably do not see themselves as exploiters. So let's try a different lens. What if I am not exploiting, but I'm simply engaging in practices designed to provide my particular affinity group with economic benefits or perceived quality of life improvements, say more jobs or cheaper electricity or a more convenient way to travel? This is a good thing, right? Well, sure, my actions might have some detrimental effects on some other people, but my group is clearly benefiting. It has nothing to do with exploitation. Other people, maybe those in other states or in other countries, other social classes, perhaps those who haven't worked as hard as I have, or who don't have my educational level, which I earned. I paid those student loans. Perhaps they don't have my legal standing. My people have a right to these benefits. Those other people can work it out on their own, just like we have. It's us versus them thinking, and it is destroying our planet. Number 2, gratitude. On our family vacation a couple of weeks ago, I read a new book called Grateful, The Transformative Power of Giving Thanks by Diana Butler Bass, and I highly recommend it, by the way. I've actually long been a big fan of gratitude, but I was fascinated by the proof that was offered in this book about how gratitude can actually change the neuron pathways in our brain. That's probably not the right language, but I'm a musician, not a scientist. But clearly, I got the concept that there is actually scientific, physiological evidence that deliberately choosing to be thankful has a profoundly positive effect on our bodies. But our culture has, for the most part, lost the habit of gratitude and replaced it with the expectation of entitlement. It's hard to feel truly grateful for something that you really deserve to get anyway. Diana Butler Bass talks about the irony of forgetting to be thankful even on the day that we in the United States have named as our Gratitude Day. Thanksgiving Day, she observes the encroachment of the Christmas season on that day, the shopping season that is. She notes that, quote, instead of giving thanks for abundance, We push to the front of the queue to make sure we get ours before anyone else beats us to it. It's us versus them. The most important thing is that I get my rightful share of the limited quantities available, because I'm afraid I might miss out. Fear is the opposite of gratitude. And here's another quote from her book that I really liked. If you're grateful, you're not fearful. And if you're not fearful, you're not violent. If you're grateful, you act out of a sense of enough, not out of a sense of scarcity, and you're willing to share. If you are grateful, you are enjoying the differences between people, and you are respectful to everybody. And that changes this power pyramid under which we live. Gratitude has ripples, constantly moving outward. Gratitude changes not only me and my chosen us, but ultimately, intentional gratitude can change all of us. And finally, number 3, community. As human beings made in the image of God, we long to be shaped, claimed, and nurtured by community. But when push comes to shove, we're afraid to give up our sense of individualism. We don't want to sacrifice me in order to become one of them. To put this in a United Methodist context, which is my own context, think about the deep fears that are unearthed when 2 congregations begin conversations about merging together. Yes, good word there. Yes. How about when 2 annual conferences merge? Or even share a bishop, which is my current situation back in the Pacific Northwest area. We don't want to lose our identity. Right. We are, in fact, fearful. We're afraid we're going to lose our traditions and our values. It's a bit ironic that right now in the United Methodist Church, our fears are ostensibly around the possibility of dividing our community, around schism. But in reality, we are already divided. And I believe what we're actually afraid of is that if we affirm once and for all that we are truly united and we are forced to live in the light of being a united community, we will lose our ability to claim that we are us and they are them. As Christians, we absolutely must remember that our God is so intent on erasing our divisions, those divisions of us and them, that God, the one who actually created those human beings in the first place, that God made the mind-blowing decision to become us. I'm a worship artist, so I have a deep appreciation for how our communal worship, our rituals, our actions, our prayers, our songs, our stories, how these shape us into community, the kind of community we long for. When we assemble each week, we have the opportunity to proclaim the countercultural understanding that us means all of us. We are gathered by the God who calls us, molded by the power of God's word, that's capital W, by the way, transformed by the gratitude that simply has to bubble up in the face of God's limitless love, and finally, blown out into the world by the Holy Spirit. As members of God's boundary-free community of love, we are sent out to tear down the divisions of us versus them. That's the charge that Dean Muelder gave us all those years ago, and it's a mission that is no less relevant today. Thank you.
Dr. Del Pino.
Let me begin by expressing my sincere and deep appreciation to Dean Moore the selection committee, and not least the one who nominated me, whoever that is, for this opportunity to be recognized as a distinguished alum of this stellar institution. After retiring from active itinerancy in 2013, I was under what I now recognize to have been an illusion that I had made it far enough out to pasture to have achieved the anonymity that was not possible across my years of ministry and service in church and society. With this day's events and the offering and receiving of this award, I know that the pop song of the early 1960s is still to be heeded, at least by me. The night has 1,000 eyes. So listen up, Gary Nettleton, Lawrence Evans, Tom Porter, Gordon O'Neill, Robert William B. McLean. I can't celebrate with you in the way that we had planned. I think you know what I mean. You do, don't you? Now to our purpose at hand. Our assigned topic is the 3 greatest challenges facing us in the next decade. As I pondered this assignment, I found it a real and not contrived challenge to enter into a thought process that would permit me to avoid doing what is inherent in a panel discussion or a panel consideration of this, for want of a better term, heuristic topic. Namely, depending on the order in which I would present, the danger of carrying coals to Newcastle. You were stellar in your presentation, and so I don't have that fear now, which means that I will be freed to say what I didn't think I wanted to say. So in the tradition of that 16th century theologian who rarely, if ever, let subtleties keep him from speaking his mind, I decided to sin boldly and let the grace of God abound all the more, trusting that exact repetition of what other panelists have shared is unlikely, and it happens, and if it happens, then so be it. I want to identify 3 things. I will not explicate them as much as I want to, because I believe that I should honor what is the timeline allowed for my colleagues. The first is, in 1816, one of the founders of our nation declared, if a nation expects to be ignorant and free in a state of civilization, if it expects rather what never was and never will be. Thomas Jefferson. This, in my view, goes to the heart of the rot that our nation in culture and societal norms and institutional life is being subjected to, and will be a challenge for at least the next decade, if not the foreseeable future. In a word, and these are not happy words, this is not a feel-good moment for me. I think that, thank you, you've already set the stage and I can just dance on it now. This is the rot that has engulfed this nation. In a word, the challenge to which I'm referring is that of anti-reason and anti-intellectualism. This is the rot that really is submerging us, specifically, and Western society generally. In my junior year in undergraduate school, I read a work that in my view has endured and is prescient for engaging our current malaise. Published in 1963 and titled Anti-Intellectualism in American Life, the author Richard Hofstadter wrote in his guardedly optimistic conclusion, one of the major virtues of liberal society in the past was that it made possible such a variety of styles of intellectual life. One can find men, that's from the 60s, notable for being passionate and rebellious, others for being elegant and sumptuous, or spare and astringent, clever and complex, patient and wise, and some equipped mainly to observe and endure. What matters is the openness and generosity needed to comprehend the varieties of excellence that could be found even in a single, rather parochial society. It is possible, of course, that the avenues of choice are being closed and that the culture of the future will be dominated, this is Hofstadter looking forward to where we are now, dominated by single-minded men of one persuasion or another. It is possible, but insofar as the weight of one's will is thrown onto the scales of history, one lives in the belief that it is not to be so. Well, I submit that because it is so anti-reason, if it is so, it is so, anti-reason and anti-intellectualism is and will remain a monumental challenge to this nation and by extension to the global reality in which we must live and move and have our being. Notwithstanding Hofstadter's effort to talk up, like Valley people, to talk up about the foreboding real possibility he had introduced, there is compelling evidence that, as Susan Jaquith, for one, in The Unreasoned America, states ever so eloquently, it is difficult to suppress the fear that the scales of American history have shifted heavily against the vibrant and varied intellectual life so essential to a functional democracy. She continues, during the past 4 decades, America's endemic anti-intellectual tendencies have been grievously exacerbated by a new species of semi-conscious anti-intellectualism, feeding and fed by an ignorant popular culture of video images and unremitting noise that leaves no room for contemplation or logic. She concludes, this new form of anti-rationalism, at odds not only with the nation's heritage of 18th century enlightenment reason, but with modern scientific knowledge, has propelled a surge of anti-intellectualism capable of inflicting vastly greater damage than its historical predecessors inflicted on American culture and politics. I do not choose the term rot lightly. Okay. Even though there are some who will not want to remember, but I do remember the inaugural address of one John R. Silver in becoming president of this university. The title of that address was The Pollution of Time. And in it, he argued, I think rather cogently, for what the poem, The Second Coming, Things Fall Apart. The reality is that we have reached, in some respects, that point at which he not predicted, but simply helped us to understand, if you continue to do this, if you continue to glorify and worship the instantaneous, instant orange juice, instant sex, whatever, you will, as a people, begin to evidence that corrosion in ways that must be accountable. You must be accountable to. I believe that it is probably a difficult thing to accept that with all of the money that is spent on higher education in this country, that we are in fact we are incubating a tremendous amount of anti-rationalism, anti-intellectualism, the left, or no, the right, I guess. Neoconservatives have now found their niche. They now are somebody in the pantheon of those who are considered to be thinkers, etc. They've got their own means of getting their junk out there in the rest of society. As much as did the liberals under John F. Kennedy in his day when he invited the academic world to become integral to the government. The reality is this, that those who are now brandishing, I think, a tremendous amount chutzpah in the way in which they are able to make such, pardon the expression, this isn't Sunday, so I can go ahead, are able to make such bass-backward statements as, truth isn't truth, or alternative facts. And don't be so harsh on them, because the real problem is that there's a whole lot of sponges out there soaking it up. Let me go on. The second challenge, given the national trajectory established in 2016 with the election of what Ta-Nehisi Coates calls the nation's first white president, is race, color, and the otherizing that results from white America's refusal to take a sustained root and branch approach to their eradication. I don't expect any amen corners on that. This is heavy stuff. But if it isn't raised in these sacred precincts, where will it be raised? I would submit that race in the United States of America is the absolute order, not the kingdom of God, as E. Stanley Jones would argue. But race is the absolute order, and such order is more virulent and potentially catastrophic than at any time in our history as a nation. As a nation, we have with the election of Donald Trump, eroded the trajectory of a second Reconstruction post-Civil War in the 19th century. Most robust, this second Reconstruction, was in the 1960s. And that requires those who are serious about analysis to cease and desist their aversion to playing the race card or being guilty of reductionist thinking, even if you have the intelligence to say it in German, French, as well as English. The rot that this challenge evidences is documentable. I find compelling and, in all candor, angering how my friend, colleague, and brother in Christ, Theodore Ted Lemuel Lockhart, makes it plain in his recent poem, Dying Days of Second Reconstruction. It's in his most recent book titled In Our Good Name. He says, the signs are everywhere. So tell it in D.C., L.A., and Montgomery, and Boston, and Selma, and Sanford, and Tyler, Texas. The second Reconstruction done got a deadly blow from the hand of the Supremes, imitating Plessy versus Ferguson. Now carving the heart from the 1965's Voting Rights Act, and another black boy killed, just like Emmett Till, in 55, cause he was caught black, acting black, and even walking black in the wrong neighborhood, caught by a wannabe crackerjack of a cop. The signs are everywhere, visible in plain sight, through the lens of slavery shaping Jim Crow, lynching, and massive resistance. So tell it from Maine to California, from Washington State to the state of Florida, the second Reconstruction is ending. When is somebody gonna shout the call? There's a meeting here tonight, a meeting here tonight, a meeting here tonight. Who will be able to say in response, we have come over a way that with tears have been watered. We have come treading our path through the blood of the slaughter. Oh, lend me the voice to shout the call. Somebody, the courage to shout the call, the courage to stand and say, can't nobody turn us around. Absolutely nobody will turn us around. This is not an option, as we believe we should have. That's what the tax cuts were all about.
That's right.
This is not an option from which none of us as Americans can flee. For until this original disruption in the very heart of the society is dealt with, everything else
is inconsequential, except the environment. Because there won't be any place for struggle if the environment goes. But if this is not dealt with, then it is indeed our darkest hour. If you don't believe me, just take a look at what has happened with apartheid South Africa. The reality is that that did not happen out of the goodness of anybody's heart. That happened because Armageddon was appending. I believe that we need to recognize in our society that with the advent of anti-intellectualism or the resurgence of it, along with this, we are in deep doo. Third problem, and it's short, and I'll be done. Finally, the third challenge that promises to vex us for the next decade, and again, probably beyond, is a 21st century version of the Babylonian captivity of the church. Generally, and the United Methodist Church specifically. This captivity, if you will, is multidimensional, most prominent of which is heralding the Lord of the church as either Christ as culture, or not infrequently, Christ as above culture. The reality is that when we gather in St. Louis in February of next year, we will endeavor to try to untangle ourselves from that, but it ain't gonna happen. It ain't gonna happen with those who are themselves already very much children, devotees of this heresy. Namely, that the church belongs to us when it is finally of God.
Yes.
Thank you so much. Reverend Lockwood-Stewart, you have the floor.
I'm grateful to God for the Los Angeles Public Schools that showed me a path to self and safety and service. For the United Methodist Church that brought me to salvation and introduced me to the world. And for Boston University School of Theology that was and is a birthplace that teaches me to go where the pain is to meet Jesus. Warsan Shira is a 30-year-old British poet born in Kenya to Somali parents. This is her poem, What They Did Yesterday Afternoon. They set my aunt's house on fire. I cried the way women on TV do, folding at the middle like a 5-pound note. I called the boy who used to love me, tried to okay my voice. I said hello, he said, Warsan, what's wrong? What happened? I've been praying, and these are what my prayers look like. Dear God, I come from 2 countries. One is thirsty, the other is on fire. Both need water. Later that night, I held an atlas in my lap, ran my fingers across the whole world and whispered, where does it hurt? Wow. It answered everywhere, everywhere, everywhere. This poem says far more eloquently than I could, that great challenges live where pain is in this world, and that pain is everywhere. 65 million people displaced by the violence of war, poverty, and ecological collapse, while 1% of this world hoards over 1/2 of the world's wealth, hungering for more. Racist repression, mass incarceration, arms dealing, death, a growth industry as private prisons warehouse child refugees. Walls and laws rise against movements of human beings, human bodies, while corporations claim eternal human rights, freedom of speech, and religious liberty. Dominant economic system ethics rooted in usury, profit, and individual self-interest. We have broken covenant with God, with each other. And creation itself groans with eager longing for a global redistribution of wealth and of pain. The labor of new creation. In naming these realities, 3 challenges I see are clarity, connectivity, and community. Last year I was in a conversation at Pacific School of Religion with Bob Johansen of the Institute for the Future in Palo Alto. He described new leadership literacies that would be required in the next decade. Johansen said that clarity will be essential, but that certainty will be a barrier to leadership in a volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous future. In his recent book, he wrote, "In a future filled with dilemmas, disruption will be rampant and clarity will be scarce. The disruptions of the next decade will be beyond many people's ability to cope. Many will be susceptible to simplistic solutions, especially from politicians and religions." Interesting. Johansen sees religions providing simplistic solutions, and I see lived and living faith bringing urgently needed depth and clarity for just such a time as this. Vision in a volatile world, clarity in a complex world. Theological reflection, social analysis, and even daily spiritual examine begins with the question, what is going on here? Or what is really going on here? As a seminary professor, as a campus pastor, and a congregational pastor, I have continually rediscovered that rigorous reflection on experience and immersive learning in community is a lifelong transformational spiritual practice that can meet these challenges. Former student and Oakland poet and artivist Marvin K. White wrote this response to his participation in an immersive course in Ferguson, Missouri, and in the Bay Area Black Lives Matter course and the movement. He said, "Our class was called an immersion course, and that's exactly what it felt like, deep and biblical and really fast. We sunk emotionally, spiritually, intellectually. We went under with community, clergy activists, and organizations. And when we came up, it was Moral Monday in Ferguson, and we were being arrested, delivering a list of demands to the Department of Justice. Ferguson was an immersion baptism, and when I came up, I knew that the people of Ferguson were never sinners, but decades and centuries of laws and practices built up on their skins was sinful." I believe that we don't need immersion courses. I think they're wonderful and have them all the time in any congregation or school that I'm working in. But because we have lives and we can hear and know and immerse ourselves in the complexities of issues wherever we are. Reading sacred texts, reading context, remembering history, and reading our stories linked to the stories of others, of our world, immersing ourselves in this complexity is a great response to this challenge in the midst of escalating disruption and weapons of mass distraction. Long ago when I was in college, I had a work-study job, and without knowing who the heck they were, I transcribed a 3-day meeting between Cesar Chavez and Paulo Freire. I had no idea who these men were or what impact they would have on my life. But as Freire wrote, reading the world precedes reading the word, and the subsequent reading of the word cannot dispense with continually reading the world. Reading of the world does precede reading the capital W word as well, and the subsequent reading of the word also requires continual reading of the world. Recently, I was asked by a professor at Haas School of Business at UC Berkeley to lead classes on empathy and compassion with undergraduates and graduates in the School of Business. Together, we engaged in theological reflection, liberative, immersive theological reflection, and they all had experiences and knowledge and wisdom that they could tap into to do that work. There's an intense interest in empathy and compassion for whatever strange endpoints people may have for these in a variety of sectors that is actually being commodified at this moment. This historical moment is an opportunity to meet this challenge, to deconstruct and to lead. And I believe Boston University School of Theology is a wonderful place to do this. Yuval Noah Harari, in his latest book, 21 Lessons for the 21st Century, writes, "In a world deluged by irrelevant information, clarity is power." The second challenge, connectivity. Making connections between struggles, stories, worlds opens new possibilities and can spark moral imagination. One simple personal example, I have diabetes, and making connections between food deserts, chronic disease, big pharma, eating disorders, the United States diet industry, and global starvation is a powerful Eucharistic liturgy. The San Francisco Bay Area is an epicenter of infotech revolution, and BU is a center for biotech as well as infotech. A challenge and capacity building role for this school of theology might be to convene and lead in interdisciplinary, ethical, moral, imaginative exploration of frameworks, practices, and principles of the merging now of infotech and biotech. As infotech merges with biotech, and economic equity could become biological inequity. As Mark Zuckerberg attempts to create networked human communities of billions of people, as we get more and more information by giving away more and more of our information, who will be in the conversation? Who will ask the questions to make just connections? Who will own the data? Who will invest in human consciousness as well as artificial intelligence? Who will explore and embody varied human communities? Who will challenge centralization of information as well as wealth? We are connected to each other, and as Matthew Fox said, Christ is the pattern that connects. The third challenge I would name is community, and I will say the least about this challenge. I really believe that Laura has done a beautiful job of that, and this does not mean it's not a great and powerful challenge or that I'm running out of time, but I wanted to say that it is already a strength of our community, both in the university, in the seminary, in the churches, and I believe it's one that we don't share stories enough, particularly seeing every community as a laboratory for exploring, expanding, deepening human community and reaching beyond the walls to do so. We are community, and we become and remain beloved community as we become and remain instruments of God's peace and justice, as we resolve to repair the breach, to heal, to build up rather than tear down, insisting with our lives in every way possible that this is God's world and every person is a child of God. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Reverend Lockwood-Stewart. David, take it away.
Well, as the last person on the panel, it's tempting to just say, I agree with my fellow panelists and call it good there. But instead, I'll ask your indulgence for the points at which I am inevitably going to repeat things you have already heard. So as an academic, you're taught to question the question. And so when I was thinking about this assignment, to think about the three greatest challenges facing us, I thought, well, you know, I want to clarify, at least in my own head, who is the us in here? And so I'm going to answer as if the question were addressed to American Christians. I recognize that not everyone in the audience will fall into both categories, but I suspect that the majority will fall into one or the other. And that is a category that I can address since I myself am an American Christian and can therefore speak from experience. I'm also, more specifically, a Protestant and United Methodist, educated, straight, white, cisgendered, male American Christian. And so I recognize that folks who are coming from other perspectives may have different answers or different challenges on their list, but this is the view from where I sit. And I will list these questions as Alex Trebek would prefer in the form of questions. So I think the first question is, can American Christians love each other and other Americans in a deeply divided country? You've already heard other panelists allude to some of the divisions characterizing our country at this point. Divisions along the lines of race, of gender, of immigrant status, of economics, of rural and urban divides, all of which correlate with what is perhaps the most significant and intractable division, which is political divisions. Scientists, or political scientists and scholars have begun talking about how political differences in our country are no longer just differences of opinion, they're differences of identity. And that political identity has become a primary form of identity that is, in some cases, determinative of other forms of identity, including religious identity. And so there are several scholars out there, including a report out just last week, arguing that for many people, it's not their religious convictions that drive their political opinions, it's their political opinions that determine their religious convictions. And so in a situation like that, what can the church say? What can the church do? Is the church sort of consigned to be a secondary phenomenon within American civil life, or is there power yet in the blood, as Andre Crouch would say, and in the church to speak a word of love in this deeply divided situation? And I want to make it clear that when I say speak a word of love, I'm not saying can't we all just get along. There are deep and important questions of justice and injustice in the country right now. And we need to recognize, though, those. What I am saying is that to draw a little bit on the thought of the great BU alumnus, Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., who I had the chance to teach a class on while I was at Reverend College. One of the things I was really impressed by his thought is that for him is the importance of love. You know, we talk a lot about King as a figure who cared deeply about justice, and obviously that's true. But for him, justice and love were combined. That the goal was not to defeat your enemies, the goal was reconciliation with your enemies. So we live in a world and a country that has a lot of conflict, a lot of people trying to defeat their enemies. Can we, the church, be a voice for love and reconciliation in that world? So the second question is, can American Christians love Christians from other countries in a deeply unequal world?
Whoa.
So I could name a lot of ways in which the world is deeply unequal between individuals and between countries. I think that deep inequality begins with economic and political inequality, but that economic and political equality then extends to inequalities of attention and understanding. So for those with the economic and the political power, they are able, they have the privilege of not having to pay attention to or understand those without the economic and political power. And when folks are deprived not just of power but of attention and understanding, that's when those with those privileges are able to ignore those without, they're able to co-opt those without, they're able to dismiss those without, they're able to demean those without. Now this is a general problem in the world today, but this is specifically a problem for Christians who are part of a global religion that includes both people from extremely wealthy and powerful countries, such as the United States, and people from extremely poor and powerless countries, such as the Democratic Republic of Congo. And specifically, this is a challenge for fellow Christians within the United Methodist Church, for whom the two largest countries of membership are the two countries I've just mentioned. How do Christians generally, and United Methodists specifically, who talk about being a global church or a worldwide church or an international church think about and manage these vast inequalities? Are we able, and especially for those of us who are American Christians and have the privilege and the power, are we able still to listen, to get information, to learn languages and cultures from those who do not have the same powers and privileges that we do? Are we able to avoid oversimplifying or stereotyping other Christians and casting them just as supporting characters in our own narratives? Are we able to understand the ways in which they are primary characters in their own narratives? Not just so that we can better help them, but so that together we can better learn together the good news that God has for us all. Learn from each other and with each other. Third and finally, what will American Christians do in a world of climate change? And this is a question not just of how or whether American Christians will be involved in trying to mitigate climate change, though that is certainly important, and American Christians must be involved in conjunction with others. This is certainly not something the American Church can do alone, but must be involved with others to try to mitigate climate change. I read a lot about Christians from elsewhere around the world, and there's no debate among Christians from elsewhere about whether climate change is happening and whether humans are involved in that. This is specifically a problem within the American church. If you can go and talk to Christians from the Philippines, especially after the super typhoon there, you can talk to Christians from Zimbabwe, and I don't care how conservative they may be theologically, this is not a debate for them. This is a way in which American Christians need to be listening to and learning from our sisters and brothers around the world, and working together there, therefore with them, to figure out how we can work to mitigate and to limit the impacts of humans on the climate. But as I said, this is not just a question of how we can limit or mitigate our impacts on the climate. It's a question of how we can respond to the change that is already happening. So my hometown of Decorah, Iowa, there's a joke. It's a town that's on the upper Iowa River. And there's a joke that nowadays 100-year floods happen every 5 to 10 years. So climate change is not something that is going to happen to us. Climate change is something that is now happening to us. I've seen, especially this summer, more and more people making this point that climate change is now. And whether that comes in the form of floods or typhoons or hurricanes or drought, that's already having impact on people in the form of adverse weather and sort of unusual weather, and often having an impact upon the poorest and most vulnerable, both domestically and internationally. And in addition to these sort of large-scale weather events, it's making ways of life impossible, no longer sustainable, as sort of these small-scale changes mount up. So I think of my STH colleague Ashley Anderson and what she taught me about small island nations, and this notion that there are entire countries that will not exist in the future. Communities in Alaska that are built on the permafrost are having had to have conversations about where do we go and how do we move an entire community, because we recognize that our way of life is no longer going to be sustainable in the future. How do we as American Christians respond both with a helping hand to those who have experienced disaster of some sort, ecological disaster, but how do we also respond with compassion and justice to those whose way of life is being squeezed out by this changing climate? And how do we work with and understand both other Americans and Christians around the world as we do this. So I've had in my mind a lot over the past couple of years another king concept, which is the title of his fourth and final book. Where do we go from here? Chaos or community? The world can seem really chaotic nowadays. It can seem chaotic when you turn on the news and listen to American politics. It can seem chaotic when you follow the events of international relations. It can seem chaotic when the next storm or flood or wildfire. But I think the word that I take from King's thought is hope. So in that book, he's struggling to speak a word of hope in the midst of that chaos. And it's the hope that in the end, community can hold us together, that community can be the order, that community can overcome chaos. We speak a lot at STH about the beloved community. And so I challenge us to have hope that that beloved community is still possible. Thank you.
We thank our panelists for such rich conversation starters. Certainly we will have plenty of conversation over dinner, but we do have a few moments right now to have some responses and questions from you all for what your colleagues have shared. And we have a microphone that one of our students, Maddie Henderson, is going to be passing around. We do ask that you wait for the microphone to come to you so that those who are joining us on live stream can hear your question. And so the floor is open to those who may want to ask questions of your colleagues, these distinguished panelists.
It's a question for Reverend Laura. It seems that our society, we have more and more, and we enjoy and appreciate it less and less. How can we get out of this cycle?
It's an excellent question. I will say again that I was really struck by my reading of Diana Butler-Bass's book, although she in her book lifts up a number of resources about gratitude. So a personal testimony. Some years ago, maybe 6 or so years ago, for a Lenten discipline, I decided to keep a gratitude journal, which is not like the world's most creative thing to do. But I decided to do it, this will sound bizarre, but on Facebook. Because I decided to do it for one reason, and that was to keep me accountable. I'm a horrible journaler, and I have a very hard time doing anything after the second day, really. It's about all off. Before I keep going. And I figured if I did it on Facebook, even if nobody was reading it, I would know it was out there public, and I would want to maintain it every day. So the accountability piece was very helpful. But what I discovered was that my own gratitude was magnified exponentially by the comments that I received from other people. My gratitude might trigger a memory or a story from somebody else, or even just the connection from an old BU friend or a person from somewhere else, another part of my life, would cause me to remember with a sense of gratitude that relationship that I would have with that person. So it was an incredibly actually transformative experience, and one that I have done every year. That worked for me. It's not the secret for everyone in the universe, obviously, but I do believe there are intentional ways that we can say, yes, I want to be thankful. And if it takes looking at the scientific research, like, well, spiritually, I don't care if I'm thankful, but hey, I want those neurons generating some, good juju inside of me. Then, whatever it takes in terms of motivation, then there are a number of things, the gratitude journal, getting together with creating a little support gratitude group, just in your daily life. So I will say my spouse is here, who's the former director of an adult retreat center. And when we were there, Todd would always counsel the staff to get rid of the language of no problem. So if I drop this and you pick it up for me, I don't respond. I might respond by saying thank you, and you would say no problem, which implies that, well, actually, it could have been a problem, but because you're in a good mood right now, it's not really a problem. So instead, if I say thank you, your response would be, you are welcome, or I was happy to do that for you. So try to help the whole staff to get into that habit of not just, oh yeah, no problem, let me blow it off, but to actually say, you are welcome. It was a pleasure to be able to serve you. So those little things, but it takes intentionality in it.
My name is Gordon O'Neill, graduated from Andover Newton Theological School in 1973. Dr. Jerome, King Del Pino, and I pastored in Springfield for a number of years together. And he reminds me of the prophet Amos. He's always on target. He's always talking about social issues. Jerry, what can we do in the black church? And you're not studying for years. Because a lot of times we're trying to see it spikes that outer step, but we too are outer step in terms of the black church. What can we do before Jesus Christ comes back out of the clouds with anti-reason and anti-intellectualism? What can we do?
Preach, Amos.
I believe that without being guilty of too much hubris, I would think that the same. Well, there used to be a commercial for 9X. If it's out there, it's in here. That has not been recognized by those who are rightly self-defining as the victims of what is occurring in the wider society. We're more American than we are African. And therefore, the anti-intellectualism, the anti-rationalism is as endemic within, I would think, the rich tradition of the black church. I think that we are subject to being led by charlatans as anywhere else. My Grundlungen here for this is, my grounding is, St. Paul says, we have all sinned and fallen short of the glory of God. And so sin is not an ethical, it cannot be ethically ghettoized. Sin belongs to the very notion of being. So for that reason, the black church has, in my opinion, tremendous potential. And that potential has always been subverted, in my opinion, again, by the fact that we have tended to be as market-driven as white evangelicals. We have participated in mammon as much. So I guess my point would be simply this, that there needs to be a real reckoning, a real sense of humility and confession about what we have failed to do in regard to the very issues that we want to lay on the national conscience.
Are there others?
I actually have a question. So, David, you touched on hope at the end, but as a third-year seminarian who has to leave here and go read Torture and Eucharist for King Teddy, could any of you speak to practices, spiritual practices that you have that help you to sustain hope? Because my granny always tells me that an unhopeful Christian is an oxymoron, but I'm like, well, then I'm an oxymoron right now because it's real hard. So, any wisdom?
Sure. And I will confess, this is something I struggle with a lot. You know, I think hope's always an ongoing project. But I think I take hope from a couple of sources. And one of that is actually learning about folks, fellow Christians throughout the world. It's nice to be reminded that your problems are not the only problems, and that not everybody has your problems. And so, you know, your problems may or may not consume you, but they're not going to consume the world. And that's, I think a hopeful thing. Possibly climate change, but we'll set that. And I think the other thing I take hope from, and it's not something I remember to do enough, but when I'm praying, when I take the time to not just tell God what my problems are and the problems I see in the world, but listen to God's voice, which, you know, sometimes addresses those problems and sometimes has nothing to do with that. And both of those, I think, are experiences that gets me outside of myself and my location and the problems that threaten to overwhelm my sense of hope for myself and my location.
I think I'd like to say a word as well. John Cobb once said that hope is a Christian virtue, optimism is not. And that it's very important for me to remember the difference between those two, and especially as an American Christian. And that some of the practices that I do, one is that the sources for your spiritual practice, for your readings, for your prayers, you know, what are those sources? Who are you listening to and praying with? And there's so many wonderful resources to do that. And the other thing that is very helpful for me is to remember, and I have a particular practice that I can talk to you about afterwards, but to remember that Jesus Christ is a crucified Lord. And that's something that we don't pay a lot of attention to. So how are you formed by a crucified Lord?
No, you please.
Well, I would add a practice that I learned here at BU, and that was to read 5 Psalms every day. That returning to the Psalms not only helps me to remember that the despair that I can feel in today's world has so many, many echoes from you know, millennia ago, and that nearly every one of those Psalms, in the midst of despair, at some point will turn to praise God. God does not forsake us. Praise God and praise God. And that is, that's the best source of hope that I can imagine.
When I began pastoring, supposedly by myself, I remember that, and I don't have it out now, which is probably a symbol of mine no longer having this responsibility for others.
Right.
But this question has reminded me of probably some of my own malaise. I used to read all the time Howard Thurman's The Negro Spiritual Speaks of Life and Death.
And then I had to cast that against the context of what I know as a historian, what I know as a black person in America, about what was the experience out of which those songs emerged. And to then ask myself the question, whither then is the God of creation for those that I can recall, that I name as heroines and heroes in my own Christian journey? And it's another way of saying that it's not about me in the final analysis, which is in my opinion it's foundational for the American ethos, to live out of a triumphalism, out of the notion of the church as empire, which my denomination is trying to recover in the way in which it is excluding God's children. I promised I wasn't going to go this road, but the roadblock has been removed. My denomination is guilty of Pharisaism on a monumental order that is in fact attacking the Ordo Salutis, the order of salvation itself that we claim that we are about. And so we have, this Pharisaism has led us to the point of believing we can once again be hopeful if we can strengthen the notion that like should be attracted to like. And no one realizes that, and some of my own brothers and sisters of color who, the Black African church, which basically is saying that they are prepared to go after this biblical literalism, this abuse of scripture, etc., and they're doing it in order to make their world what they think is, that's nothing they do with the will of God.
Right, their world.
Good theology never presumes to be able to interpose what is, just anthropomorphic nonsense. And so it's important to have a discipline. To finish my point, it's important to have a discipline that says that it's not really finally about me. We can say it's me, oh Lord, stand in the need of prayer. But in the final analysis, God's creation is large enough, is great enough to be able to subsume all of this background noise, and which all of the Trumpsters are. This background noise, and sound and fury signify nothing other than the fact that they're leading us in a direction that is going to be destructive. But it's not all about us. And the church, whatever church I'm attending, I'm down in the buckle of the Bible Belt now, and the bottom line is that, it's bad theology. I mean, there's bad theology up here as well, but it's bad. There's bad theology. There's bad theology, and Dean Moore, please forgive me, but that is being adumbrated by the seminaries. And so we've got to figure out a way to help those who go out as servants of the servants of God to understand this is not finally about them, in spite of the good pension program we have.
In these final moments, I wonder if our panelists, if you all could speak to, I love, Reverend Laura, that you began by investigating the question of us versus them. And then we finished, David, with you highlighting that question of, well, who is the us in this question of what are the challenges facing us? And I'm aware that we are in the Northeast, which is the second least churched area of the country, second only to the Pacific. And I'm really moved as each of you speaks so So genuinely, out of your faith convictions and the way that it is allowing you to see the challenges and to see the hope for the future through those challenges. But I wonder if you could speak to how we train theologically informed leaders to go forth and speak these truths, speak this hope, and lead a way into this new future among a population that does not share the narratives of faith that fund your visions. How do we not succumb to an us versus them mentality and create a we if the foundations of that unity do not exist? How do we confront that future, and particularly as a seminary training these leaders of tomorrow? What, in your experience and wisdom, can you share with us about how we help these young folks and some older folks who are going into ministry navigate that new terrain?
So are we going in the same order?
Whoever wants to jump in. I did pick on you though, because you're in order.
Well, it's been interesting to me as we prepare. So, and this is very United Methodist centric, with apologies to those who are not part of the UMC in this room or on the live stream. But the UMC is pretty obsessed at the moment as we go into February of 2019, our special called General Conference, what will happen. And as I connect with people in various parts of the country in particular, not so much globally, but various parts of the US church, I'm hearing a lot of angst, particularly in the Southeast, around what is going to happen. Well, we shouldn't even make any plans right now because we don't know what's going to happen after February of 2019. So, let's just wait and see what's going to happen. And for those of us in the West, and especially in my part of the West, in the Northwest, we're sort of, we're just doing our thing. And in reflecting about this, I'm coming to think, I could be totally wrong, but the Southeast is the Bible Belt. In that part of the country, there's been a much greater expectation that going to church is how you do things. And in the West, and especially the Northwest, that expectation left the station long, long ago. And so we've been dealing for a long, long time with how do we get outside of the church building because people are not coming to us? How do we change our language because people don't understand God language? How do we get into the streets and into the prisons and into the social agencies where people are and where they have the need? Because that's where the ministry is calling us. So that's what we've been doing in my part of the country. And it doesn't really matter, sorry, General Conference, what decision gets made in February of 2019. We're going to keep doing that. And so I don't know that I'm answering your question exactly, but I think that would be the word of advice, if you will, that I would have for those who are training our leaders. Don't expect that it's going to be same old, same old. Don't expect even that you're training to be the pastor of a congregation that gathers at 11 o'clock on Sunday morning. You might be the equipper of a group of disciples who gather at some point in the week to be shaped and inspired to go out into the community where the ministry needs are. And that's what you need to get your head around, that it's not going to be the same as it was 20 years ago or maybe even yesterday.
Would anyone else like to speak to that?
Sure. Well, I think people should actually study more mission. Both in terms of figuring out how to engage a post-Christendom and post-Christian in the United States. But I think especially within the realm of mission, the skills and attitudes and habits necessary for cross-cultural engagement. And I'll say engagement because it's always an ongoing process. You're never quite competent. There's always more to learn. But I think when we as Christians interact with those who are not coming from Christian traditions. I think that's a form of cross-cultural engagement. I think when Christians from different areas of the country are interacting with each other, that's a form of cross-cultural engagement. You know, Colin Woodard has written a great book about how the different regions of the United States are really different cultural regions. And certainly when American Christians are interacting with Christians elsewhere, that's cross-cultural engagement. And so I think our seminaries really need to be helping their students learn those skills and attitudes necessary for cross-cultural engagement.
I wonder if Reverend Lockwood-Stewart, given your experience with both campus ministry and church ministry, what wisdom do the young folks of today have to teach those of us who are still committed to local churches?
I think that God is alive and at work on campus and community, and that I think what we need to do is listen and learn and immerse ourselves in a lot of complexity. One of the faculty members today talked about the sociological tools of really accepting, appreciating, and learning from the complexity of others. And I really feel that's what's called for. I also feel we need to listen, and then we need to listen. And then we need to listen, and then we need to be in solidarity, and then we need to listen. And then I also feel we need to have other languages. Right now on universities across the nation, there's leadership development going on. The attacks on universities and free speech and the distortions of what's happening in universities right now is just at a time when the church is disinvesting, not only in theological education, which it supports, I know, but also in higher education, in campus ministries, in public education. I really feel we need to reinvest at a profound and overwhelmingly huge way in education. And the language, for example, at UC Berkeley, when the student leaders are being trained, and hundreds of them being trained to lead community service, and the kind of work that they do, they talk about meaning making rather than theological reflection, but they're talking about it. And I think we need to learn the languages that they're using to do it, and to go to accompany them and be transformed ourselves. So.
And finally, Dr. Del Pino, what word of wisdom do you have for your old school?
No guarantee of wisdom, but I will say this, that the complexity of theological education in a culture that is gone wild, a culture in which you still have the folks who are leading in the church who say, yes, I want change, but not until I die. Even then, I want to leave you enough money so that you'll be able to stay open with this moribund theology, even when the rapture comes. But I think that even though the church has not permitted an arena, Dean, to be naturally available in which bishops of the church, chairs of boards of ordained ministry of the church, and if you can extrapolate and take this into other denominations, will sit and talk about what do we mean about competent, committed leaders. And if you cannot talk about that in rational terms, in compelling terms, amongst the bishops of the United Methodist Church, or when I was working with Roy Medley in regard to the American Baptists, he said, I don't have anywhere to go in order to have a conversation about all of this cry for competent leadership. Well, the church needs to learn, needs to gain a degree of humility, and it can happen if the smackdown is hard enough.
Yes.
I know that's language that most Christians don't care to hear, but the reality is that there must be some corrective. If the pushback is strong enough, the deans and presidents of the United Methodist Schools of Theology can say, all right, let's look at call, let's look at what we mean when we say that we are assessing someone's claim that they are those
They are persons who should be sanctioned to speak for God. What really is to be the litmus test?
Right.
And right now, we've got, you know, in our denomination, we've got laity sitting on the board of the ministry, but they are as, in my opinion, they are as clericalized as the clergy. And so therefore, there is no real dynamic that is occurring where we can have a sophisticated, and I don't mean that in an elitist sense, but a sophisticated, complicated, but very compelling understanding of what we mean when we say this person is called of God.
Right.
And it's not just simply where I'm trying to address some insecurities in my life. The seminary can certify this person does not have more problems than the congregation you're going to send. Okay? And I'm finished. So therefore, there is missing right now in this enterprise, in this educative enterprise, there's missing the commitment to be serpentine, to be able to be countercultural, and to the extent that that is required in order for the church to be able to be the church. Because I believe, I may be wrong, I believe that we have what we have because of what we put into it. And we put into it, you know, we're asking you to make bricks without straw.
Yes.
And in my opinion, the church really has a responsibility to create an environment where bishops can be held accountable, chairs of boards of ordained ministry can be held accountable, and local churches within the free church tradition can be held accountable for their making a political decision over against a decision that is driven by their theology and their fidelity to Scripture.
Yes. Wisdom to contrive.
Won't you join me in thanking this